Here I'm going to talk about this theory of consciousness, which is a neuroscientific theory of consciousness, integrated information theory. If you are not familiar with the theory, I'm going to present it very briefly in a couple of minutes. But basically what I'm going to say now is I'm trying to find a way to place this neuroscientific theory in the debate about the metaphysics of consciousness. Okay, so that's the idea at least. So the main claim of the talk is that there is an emergentist interpretation of IIT that I call emergentist IIT. This interpretation is internally coherent and faithful to the theory. The scope here, I don't want to say that emergentist IIT is a true theory of consciousness, right? I want to at least limit the scope. My claim is a conditional claim. So if you find IIT promising as a neuroscientific theory of consciousness, then you have this metaphysical option available. The goal is to provide an alternative to the mainstream interpretation of IIT, which sees IIT as a form of panpsychism, right? So Tononi, Giulio Tononi, and Christoph Koch, the main architects, if you want, of IIT, have argued for a panpsychist interpretation of IIT. I'm going to say that this is not quite right from a metaphysical point of view. Okay, so a brief presentation of the theory. Then we are going to look at some assumptions that we need if you want to build this emergentist IIT, then a formal result that is supposed to support it. And then we try to interpret these results and then a final picture. Okay, so a bit of background. As we said, IIT is a theory of consciousness. So what we're trying to explain here is, phenomenal consciousness, what it is like to be a subject, right? It's like to be a person. The cool thing, I think, of this theory is that it doesn't start by looking at brain scans, or fMRI, anything like that. It starts by looking at consciousness itself. So the idea is, let's try, to sit on your armchair and try to figure out the essential fundamental properties of your own experience, right, of consciousness. IIT does this and calls these axioms, these are called the axioms of the theory, then tries to translate this axiom into postulates, which are supposed to tell you how the physical world, in terms of cause-effect powers, is supposed to be in order to give rise to those phenomenal properties that you picked out in the axiom. Okay, and then when you do this, you have a sort of identity between the phenomenal and the physical. Okay, so these axioms, which are really fundamental for the theory, are intrinsic existence. This is the first axiom. So consciousness exists from an intrinsic perspective. This composite is structured, so you can distinguish the different aspects, different things in your conscious field. It is extremely specific in the sense that each particular experience is what it is, and if you change something about your own conscious experience here and now, you would have a different experience, right? So information in the sense of difference, right? Difference that makes a difference. Integration, it is irreducible. So if you look at, this is the unity of consciousness, right? If you look at a red triangle, you don't experience redness and triangularity, you experience the unity of a red triangle. The last axiom, exclusion, is a bit tricky, but the idea is that basically consciousness has definite borders in space and time. You don't experience, for example, your conscious visual field in black and white, you experience with color, you don't experience more, you don't experience like your blood flow or something like that. Okay, so you do this, then you translate into the physical world. Here, we don't have time to go through, but this is information, the postulate of information, and the idea is to measure in information theoretic terms how a particular mechanism in a state makes a specific difference to the system. That's why supposed to capture the specificity, the information axiom. So a mechanism in a state, given that state, makes a difference to what's going on in the system, right? And then you do the same here on the right, you have integration. And here the idea is to capture how the system as a whole system makes a difference to itself, right? So over and above the sum of its parts. Okay, so this is the reducibility, the integration postulate. Okay, you do this for all the 5 axioms, and then you land here. So here you have, this is basically the only thing that we need. Here in the slides, this comes from the most recent version of the theory, IIT 3.0. The idea is that this Greek letter phi here is a measure of integrated information. According to the theory, given that we started from consciousness, that means that that is a measure of consciousness itself. Okay. So this is the neuroscientific background, if you want. Then the main proponents of the theory say this. Okay, this is a long quotation, but it's kind of nice. So in line with the central intuition of panpsychism, IIT treats consciousness as an intrinsic fundamental property of reality. The axioms and postulates of IIT say that consciousness is fundamental, observable, independent property that can be accounted for by the intrinsic cause-effect power of certain mechanism in a state, and they give form to the space of possibilities in the past and the future. This is what we just saw. Analogies with mass, right? So, which can be defined by how it curves space-time around it. It said that in the case of experience, the entities having the property are not elementary particles, but complexes of elements. Okay, so you can see that this panpsychist interpretation, right, is based on this intrinsicality of integrated information and the fundamentality of integrated information. We should find a way to reinterpret intrinsicality and fundamentality in a sort of physicalist friendly way, and now I'm going to say what I mean by that. If we can do this, then we can provide an alternative option to the panpsychist interpretation. I argue that emergentist IIT can do this. So if we want to do this, we can try to start from a different set of assumptions, which are not compatible with panpsychism, trying to plug these assumptions, like, you know, into the formal framework of IIT and see whether we have end up with a coherent narrative at the end. And the idea here is that, of course, we have to remain as close as possible to IIT, and this means endorsing pandispositionalism. I'm sure that you have already captured this point. So if you are defining the physical in terms of cause-effect powers, cause-effect happenings, you are saying that all the properties that exist in the world are dispositional properties. Yeah, they're defined by what they do. IIT is actually explicitly endorsed this. There is a paper by Matteo Grasso working in Tononi's lab that actually argues for this. And then, of course, the main result, consciousness, is somehow explained by integrating information, even if you don't endorse the strict identity that IIT poses between consciousness and integrating information in a strong sense. At least we have to endorse a weak form of this relation. So we can use, at least in humans, in well-established contexts, we can use phi to predict and explain conscious phenomena. And then here on the right, we have another set of assumptions, which can call minimal physicalism, using the label from David Lewis. So the idea of David Lewis was minimal physicalism is just the idea that the mental supervenes on the physical, is dependent on the physical, without further, without requiring that there is a sort of metaphysical necessity, without requiring that the mental supervenes with metaphysical necessity on the physical. Okay, where the physical can be defined through the so-called via negativa. So we just say that we don't want mentality at the bottom level, the micro level of reality. We don't want mentality there. Okay. So these are the, if you want, the assumptions that we need to build an emergentist IIT. So given this, we can look at this formal result due to the work done mainly by Eric Coyle, other people in his lab. So what they show is that a system reaches phi max when it is analyzed at the macro level, not at the micro, where macro states are individuated by coarse graining different micro states into one macro state. So here, for example, you have the microsystem A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, you can take A and B and consider them as one thing, right? And call that thing alpha. And you can do the same here. C and D can be coarse grained into beta, E and F into gamma. What they show is that the phi max, the integrated information of alpha, beta, gamma is higher than the phi max of the micro system A, B, C, D, and F. According to them, their expression is the macro beats the micro. This happens because of the coarse graining itself, right? So a coarse grain state is more robust, is less sensitive to the noisy condition or the changes that you can have at the micro level. And that means that by exhibiting this robustness, a macro level state can make more difference, more influential to the system than a micro level state. And under the difference-making account of causation that IIT endorses, IIT causes analysis is basically an interventionist. Causal analysis is a form of interventionism. This amounts to showing that the macro level is more causally relevant than the micro, okay, in line with what some philosophers already pointed out. We can measure this causal gain. Okay, you can measure information directed term, basically just a difference between that inequality that we saw earlier. We can call this causal gain causal emergence. This is how Eric Coyle and colleagues call it. Interestingly, this causal emergence occurs both spatially and temporally. Both if you coarse grain over temporal spatial states and temporal states, you have this causal emergence, which seems to provide then the optimal spatial temporal scale at which consciousness as integrated information arises. Okay, so this is all good. Now, if we want to use this formal result to support a metaphysical view, we need to show that this phenomenon, this causal emergence, is a phenomenon, in nature, not just a matter of how we describe the system, not just a matter of finding the right level of analysis. Right? Joe de Woest, in a recent paper, pointed out that the interventionist framework upon which IIT causal analysis is built cannot really provide this metaphysically robust reading of causal emergence, because, at the end of the day, it is the observer that is doing the coarse graining, that is doing the averaging, that is doing the perturbation, and so on. So it means that it seems to be the observer that gains information by analyzing the system at the micro level. It's not that the system itself gains information, causal information, right, at the macro level. And if this is true, then we have a problem here, because it means that we can't use this formal result to support the idea that integrated information as emergent phenomenon accounts for intrinsicality, which is the idea that integrated information is observer independent. Okay. So we need to be careful here, but I think there is a way out. Because if you accept in that weak form that I mentioned earlier, if you accept that consciousness is somehow paid out by phi max, we are accepting that the extrinsic causal analysis that we perform on a system, okay, actually reveals an intrinsic phenomenon. Okay? It reveals an actual phenomenon from the perspective of the system itself. And this is how Tononi puts it. Consciousness is a way of being rather than a way of knowing. So according to the IIT, being implies knowing from the inside. Describing instead implies knowing from the outside. So seems to me that if you want to deny that IoT can actually reveal the intrinsic being, how the system is from its own intrinsic perspective, then I think we are actually denying interventionism itself. That seems to me the case. And there is this nice quotation from Woodward. Says, yeah, look, we can say that what matters for whether X causes Y is the intrinsic character of the X-Y relationship. But the attractiveness of an intervention is precisely that it provides an extrinsic way of picking out or specifying this intrinsic feature. So this kind of resonates with what Tononi, I think, has in mind, right? The fact that the extrinsic way of picking out through causal analysis certain phenomena, it is an accurate way of picking out whatever is going on intrinsically in that system of interest. So, given how successful used interventionism is across sciences, it is at least reasonable. We have at least good reasons to accept this as a framework and to work with this framework. Okay. So this is a defeasible argument. Of course, this is just to say that we have good reasons, but defeasible reasons to use interventionism. But since we have good reason to accept interventionism, I think we have good reason to think that causal emergence is an observer independent phenomenon, right? An actual phenomenon in nature. So, okay, if you accept this, then we can try to make sense of what Howell and colleagues say here. So they say the search, which is an extrinsic search, okay, the observer that does the searching, if you want, right? The search for a maximum of integrated information that identifies a definite spatial temporal scale at which a set of elements self-defines as a complex. And this is the intrinsic phenomenon, right, that extrinsic search is supposed to capture. So the grain size at which it comes into focus causally from its own intrinsic perspective. This idea of coming into focus causally, right, this seems to be the intrinsic phenomenon that is picked out by IIT causal analysis. But it is not really clear to me what it means, right? So yeah, we have some sort of system that self-defines at the macro spatial temporal scale, but what it means exactly for integrated information to be this sort of emergent phenomenon, right? I think we need to pair this formal result with the conceptual analysis if you want to understand exactly what it means for integrated information to be an emergent phenomenon. Given that emergent phenomena are commonly defined as phenomena both dependent upon and autonomous from their basis, physical basis, we need to understand how these two features are exhibited by integrated information as emergent phenomena. Right? So we need to make sense of the dependence relation, so the dependence of its physical substrate, the autonomous relation, how integrated information is autonomous from its physical substrate. Okay, so now we have another constraint, I think here, because we have said that causal emergence is a real phenomenon in nature, right? Intrinsic phenomenon of nature, and this seems to be kind of close to what people call a form of strong emergence, right? Not just a matter of us being unable to reduce the phenomenon. And this strong emergence is generally considered at odds with physicalism, right? While I said that we want to be somehow physicalist friendly. So here, the constraint is to try to find a conceptualization of emergentist IIT that is somehow in between strong emergence and minimal physicalism, right? At least minimal physicalism. So we have to keep this in mind, I think. Okay, so how do we do this? We need to look at some guidelines from IIT One, I think we already saw this at the beginning, right? The entities having the property of consciousness, okay, are not elementary particles, but complexes of elements. I think this is quite an important piece of information to keep in mind. Then this is a bit tricky. The physical substrate and integrated information do not exist at the same time as two different things, right? So this is how Tononi puts it. IIT emphasizes that the substrate does not exist as such separately from the cause-effect structure it specifies. Rather, it exists as that structure. Okay, so the physical substrate exists as the informational structure that it specifies. Okay. The third one is another important guideline. I'm sure that some of you already understood this point, I guess, in what I said earlier. But the idea is that integrated information is basically synonymous with causation. And the idea is that they are the same thing because they are forms of difference making. Okay. So this is clear from how they put it. IIT 3.2 explicitly treats integrated information and causation as one and the same thing. Perhaps to understand this point better is better if we understand of information in the Latin sense of the term, right? Giving shape, giving form to things, rather than the classic Shannonian sense of the term. IIT is explicitly not using the Shannonian notion of information. Okay. So let's try to make sense of integrated information as emergent phenomenon. Again, to repeat, the goal here is to provide an interpretation of the intrinsic phenomenon that is extrinsically picked out by the formal result of causal emergence. Okay. So these are some candidates to understand the dependence relation. Now, I don't have time to go through all of this, but so I think I will focus on the fusion model because I think it's the most accurate way of describing the dependence relation here of integrated information from its substrate. So in fusion, at least how Humphreys put forward the model back in the 90s, you have at least, you know, some property instances, okay, that blend together in a sort of diachronic fashion, okay, to form a novel property instance, okay. So the idea here is, if we use this model in this case, in IIT case, the idea is that the causal powers, okay, of the elements, of the physical elements that compose the physical substrate of consciousness, how IIT calls it, the causal powers of these elements fuse together, okay, to give rise to this sort of novel causal property which integrated information is, right? So integrated information kind of summarizes, subsumes the causal powers of the physical elements, okay, of the substrate. And there is no really causal competition between these two levels, if you want, between the integrated information and the causal powers of the elements, because the causal powers of the elements are summarized, are now, if you want, part of integrated information itself as a new causal property. Okay. So this is how we can interpret the dependence relation, if you want. And now we can try to make sense of what it means for integrated information to be this new form of, you know, difference making, right? And I think that if we make sense of this, we make sense of how and why integrated information is an autonomous, it is irreducible to the physical substrate. I think the best way to understand the autonomy relation is looking at downward causation, or better, perhaps the best way is to use what Thompson and Varela called global to local determinative influence, right? Since that now you have this global phenomenon of integrated information, okay, And this global phenomenon constrains the micro-level dynamics upon which it depends, right? So the idea in this form of the one causation is that you have a macro-level dynamics that evolves at a slower temporal scale that depends on the micro-level dynamics, but it also constrains how the macro-level dynamics unfold, okay? We can call this form of emergent causation intrinsic constraining because it is the system that, that kind of gains the ability of constraining its own micro-level dynamic, okay? This is an interesting point. So this is quite interesting because Jessica Flack reached a similar conclusion from a different point of view. What she says is that adaptive systems identify regularities in evolutionary or learning time and use these perceived regularities to guide behavior. He said, I propose we move from simple feedback, to downward causation when components tune behavior in response to estimates of coarse-grained aggregate properties. So the idea is that if you have coarse-grain on the one hand, coarse-graining on the one hand, then automatically you have downward causation on the other hand. So the idea is that it is the system itself that that has a sense of these estimates, that does this estimate, or that understand the fact that the system has reached a coarse-grained, a higher level pattern, and the components of the system then tune their behavior in response to this estimate. And I think this is a kind of close to what I think emergentist IIT might say. Okay, so this is basically the final picture. Okay, so here you have like these causal powers of the physical substrate that fuse together to give rise to integrated information, which in turn integrated information basically is this form of intrinsic constraining on the system itself. This is only one thing here. There is only one thing here. This form of constraining basically determines the unfolding dynamic of the micro level. Okay. I think that this picture accounts for the intrinsicality property because integrated information is intrinsic constraining of the sense that we just saw. It also accounts for fundamentality because integrated information is this fundamentally novel form of causation. It is a fundamentally novel form of difference making that is irreducible to the type of difference making that we see at the micro level. So you have something new, although you have a novel form of causation that depends on causation itself, if you want. If you think of causation in terms of difference making, you can try to make sense of this expression that IIT proponents use, like coming into focus causally, or from its own intrinsic perspective. Instead, we have the system that self-defines itself by spatio-temporally fusing the sum of the causal powers of its elements to give rise to this global phenomenon that constrains the behavior of the system elements. I think that this picture remains as close as possible to IIT because it doesn't require major theoretical revisions. And it is consistent with minimal physicalism because the only ingredient that we have here is a physical causation. So consciousness is a form of this physical causation, is a form of difference making, right? So we do not have a discontinuity. That's the idea. The result is that we have this sort of physicalist friendly account to place in the debate, the metaphysics of consciousness. The account is a viable alternative to the panpsychist interpretation because, as I said, we do not have mentality at the bottom, right, as panpsychism requires. And if one takes IIT seriously but is not happy with the panpsychist metaphysics, I think that the emergentist IIT is a viable option, is worth taking seriously. Okay, so that's all. Yeah, thank you. This is my email. If you have any comments or anything, feel free to reach out.